and you're set to go. The rest of the time is yours.
Thank you, ma'am. That was such a good introduction. Thank you. So hello, everybody. Ellen said she recognized a lot of the names. I see a lot of unfamiliar names, so I appreciate y'all for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn today. Like Ellen said, I work here at Alzheimer's Services. I'm a program coordinator here. And so hello, welcome. I so appreciate y'all being here today and dedicating some time to talking about this topic and listening and hearing and allowing yourself some time and space to be with this topic. I know that not everyone is very comfortable talking about death or talking about loss and grief. So I appreciate you setting this time aside to lean into that a little bit more. And I also want to mention that dying and death is extremely personal. And so I absolutely encourage you to, listen to this presentation. And if you hear something that doesn't sit well with you or you think that doesn't apply to me, leave it. That's completely okay. Like I said, it is very personal, and take what benefits you and what serves you. And it's okay to leave something that doesn't. Within the emails that Ellen sent out about with the Zoom link, there was a little journal page if you wanted to use that. If not, I encourage you to have a piece of paper or a journal of some type, notepad or something next to you during this presentation, either to jot down some thoughts that come up throughout the presentation, or we will also have some times within the presentation that we have set aside for reflection, with some reflection questions. So I encourage you just to have that handy as well. I also wanted to share that we will not have a question and answer as a part of this Lunch and Learn like we normally do as a part of Lunch and Learns. What we're going to do instead is, of course, if you have any questions, issues with the technology or something, go ahead and put those in the chat. Ellen's going to help you out. But for just general questions about the material or insight or anything like that you wanted to provide, y'all can just hold those to yourselves. We're just gonna take this as a time to be with ourselves and personal within our thoughts and communication through this presentation. And so while we have a full hour set aside on this Zoom all the way until 1 o'clock Central Time, anytime that is available after my presentation, we're just going to keep this Zoom open so that it is a set aside time that you can sit with these reflections and with these thoughts, because I know sometimes it is a little bit easier to think about challenging things like this when you have time set aside. So we're going to keep that today instead of a regular Q&A, but we'll have our contact information at the end should you need to discuss something further. Let me go ahead and click to the next slide. All right, so I know Ellen gave me a little bit of an introduction, but I'm going to talk a little bit more personally about myself. If you don't know me personally, I think, like I said, talking about death, talking about something as intimate as dying and end of life, it can sometimes help to know where someone is coming from when they have a little bit of a soapbox like this to get on. So a little bit about me. And then I'm also going to talk about an overview next of kind of how this presentation will run for our time today. So a little bit about me. My largest fear from the earliest that I can possibly remember was death and dying. So I vividly remember from a very, very young age, 8, 7, being panicked and almost like paralyzing fear when thinking about death and dying. So I say that because if you also have this discomfort or aversion to talking about death and dying, that is not unusual, and that, especially within our culture, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is probably pretty common. And so I say that to say that, I've been there. And so if you also feel that little bit of anxiety when it comes to this topic, I get it. So I held that fear up until about 5 years ago, whenever I had my own children. And whenever I had my beautiful daughter, who's now 4.5, I had this realization that I'm going to have to teach her about death and dying. And people within our lives are going to die. And I am going to need to be the person that builds those, critical thinking skills around this. And so that was kind of a moment for me that I said, like, I really need to go on a journey and see where this fear of mine comes from so that I could better, um, you know, teach my daughters. And so that kind of led me on this long and really freeing journey of exploring death and dying, and eventually led me to become an end of life doula. As Ellen mentioned in my introduction, I have worked with people with dementia for quite a long time, over 15 years now. So I am very used to being around death and being around people who are in the end of life stages, or chronically ill, terminally ill, to be thinking about death often. So that is not something that hasn't been new to me, but thinking about death and having it be expected is something that I'm familiar with just through my work and what I do. And then also, I also wanted to mention that I was raised very Catholic. And with that, I think it's important to recognize that each of us have our own cultures that we are raised in. Each of our own cultures have different values and knowledge that's given to us, and customs that we practice within the group of people that we're raised in or that we choose to live in. And those relationships within your cultures impacts how you think about death and dying, as well as every other part of life, but definitely the relationship with death and dying. And so I also wanted to share that, that also was a place that I was kind of learning from within my past. And also, I say that to bring up a point that it's okay to explore your relationship with death and dying in a way that is different than you may have been initially taught, and seeing what feels right for you and what makes sense for you within your critical thoughts. Okay, so I'm pregnant with my first daughter, and I'm, going down this road of, oh my gosh, I need to learn about this so that I can teach my kid. And I kind of snowballed into this world that was death doula. And I discovered this woman. Her name is Alua Arthur. I'll talk about her a little bit later. And I was fascinated by her and what she does as a end of life doula. And so through, you know, researching and leaning into this whole world of people that call themselves end of life doulas and have this practice, I, as of last year in 2024, went through a training with INELDA, which is the International End of Life Doula Association, and became a trained end of life doula. And so it's through my years of working with people who are in their end of life and experiencing, caring for people with dementia. And then also as my training as an end of life doula is how I'm coming to you with this presentation today from those perspectives. So also, what is an end of life doula? What are we even talking about? What even is that? So INELDA defines an end-of-life doula as a non-medical companion who provides personalized and compassionate support to individuals, families, and their circles of care as they encounter and navigate death, loss, and mortality. An end-of-life doula advocates to empower dignity throughout the dying process. So that is the taken from the website INELDA definition of what an end of life doula is, and then how I utilize and how I practice as an end of life doula is usually through Alzheimer's services and through my job here, which is providing a opportunity to speak with care partners and people diagnosed with dementia, providing an opportunity to speak openly and frankly about death and dying, providing us an open and welcoming space that those conversations can be had. And then also helping or supporting and connecting people with the opportunity to create advanced care directives, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then also just through supporting care partners who are navigating dementia and dying, which is also something that we'll talk about today. So here's our objectives for what we're going to talk about during our time together today. First, we're going to reflect upon our own relationship with death, dying, loss, and grief. We are going to define some common forms of grief, loss, and fear, and how those can interconnect sometimes. We'll discuss how a diagnosis of dementia can add complicated feelings and challenges around death. We'll also consider our own preferences with death and dying. And then finally, we will explore some of my recommended resources and support services for this topic. If you are not a person that has, dove much into the end of life or death care field, like if you work in hospice or something, you may know a lot about a lot of these resources. But if you're kind of brand new to all of this, I'm happy to say that there is a plethora of people and organizations that are extremely supportive and compassionate that work in this niche. And so while death and dying is extremely nuanced, if there is a way of support that you prefer, I bet it exists. So we'll talk about some of those as well. So I know I just was talking about how I've had these aversions to talking about death and dying prior. So right now we're going to set up some time for us to have a reflection. So if you wanted to gather that journal and write things down, or you even can, just think these things in your mind, the answers to these questions and how you feel, or even you can say it out loud. Everybody's on mute. Nobody's going to hear you. You can also do that. So I'm going to time it. We're going to have a few seconds we'll have about 20 seconds for each of these questions. So first, we're just going to kind of step back and we're going to set the scene. We're first going to take a deep breath and recognize that you are in a safe space right now and that there are no wrong answers to any of these questions. And nor will you have to share your answers to any of these questions. So this is just an opportunity for you to sit with these questions. I'm going to read them out loud. So if you wanted to close your eyes or something, that's perfectly fine too. But recognize that we're in a safe space. There's no wrong answers, and you don't have to share these with anybody should you not want to. So let's take one more deep breath, and then I'm going to read out our first question. What is your relationship with death? And do you have an aversion or reaction when you think or hear about dying? And then how do you want to think or feel about death and dying? And then here is just a little silly comic about death and good communication. All right. So now that we've kind of opened ourselves up to exploring this space with our intentions to gain some insight on dying and preparing for loss, we're going to first look at some of the terms that we use to explain some of our feelings and our experiences. So, just for us to think within our own minds, what terms do you usually associate when thinking about death and dying? These are some pretty common ones right here that we'll kind of go through and define, but it could be something to explore and look into with how you feel about it. Um, I also want to say that putting terms and putting words to our feelings can only help us. It can only help us understand how we're feeling and then further explore exactly where either that feeling comes from, or if we wanted to do something with that feeling, it also allows us to jump off from that point too. So just putting a word to a feeling sometimes can be really liberating. So the first word is fear. And that is defined as an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that something is dangerous. And this fella, William Steckel, he was a psychologist and one of Sigmund Freud's earliest followers and students. He hypothesized that every fear is a fear of death. And I found that really interesting whenever I first heard that, thinking that you can trace most of your fears. So, whether that be heights or illness or loneliness, you can trace a lot of those fears back to being a fear of death, which I thought was really an interesting thing to consider. Next is loss. And loss, not talking just in terms of death, but really just any type of loss, is the state or feeling of grief when deprived of someone or something of value. And then, because of course we're talking everything within the context of considering dementia, ambiguous loss may be a term that you hear quite often when talking about dementia care. And that is a type of loss that is unclear or without resolution or closure. And sometimes people describe ambiguous loss as mourning someone who is here but not here at the same time. And then next is grief. And grief, of course, is defined as deep sorrow. And it's also, I think, important to note that grief and mourning, even though those are not, positive, feelings that we all want to feel, they're very normal and expected after a loss. And so, if you're one of those people, I'm one of these people that, I want to feel good all the time. Sometimes it's normal and natural to not feel good, to feel bad, and to sit with that and allow those feelings to be present. And then along with grief, we have anticipatory grief. And that is, again, with dementia, we hear this a lot of the emotional experience that occurs before an actual death, and can bring a lot of feelings along with it, like sadness, anger, anxiety, numbness, anticipating grief even before it's happened. And then, so we're going to dive into a couple of these. So, fear was the first term that I mentioned. One perspective about fear is from Marie Curie, who was the first woman who won a Nobel Prize. And she says that nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less, which I thought was really interesting. And then also, I want to dedicate a small bit of time to talking about this article in a study that I found through Psychology Today from Dr. Jade Wu, um, who has done some studies about fear of death and also how that connects with culture and religion specifically. Um, and here's a quote from her that says, "Fearing death makes it harder for us to process grief." And the study that she was working on said that found that those who were afraid of death were more likely to have prolonged symptoms of grief after losing a loved one compared to those who are more accepting of death, which I thought that was fascinating because, whenever you intentionally try not to think about something, it's because you're trying to protect yourself. Whereas by not trying to think about it, the opposite is actually happening, which I thought was fascinating. And Dr. Jade Wu, also a part of this same study, talked about religion and religious findings. And the reason why I bring that up, and the reason why I mentioned at the beginning of this that I was raised Catholic, is because um, one, within our culture here in Louisiana, it's estimated that between 70 and 84% of Louisianians identify as Christian, as with their spiritual and religious beliefs. And so that's a big chunk of our culture here locally. And within this study, those who identified as moderately to very religious were the people within the study that said that they are the ones that feared death the most. So within this study, and your experience very well could be different. The folks that said that they were more religious were also the ones that said that they feared death more, uh, which is, I think, interesting, something to consider. And I think that's also very telling as to how certain cultures impact how you view death and dying by what you're taught, what's around you, what you're hearing, how other people respond to death whenever it's around you. So just something for us to consider. Next up, we're going to talk about grief. A large component, of course, of loss is the effects afterwards. And so that normally includes grief. So these information from this slide I got from INELDA, which of course was the International End of Life Doula Association. And they said that grief is not linear, nor is it orderly. It can be confusing and chaotic, which no truer words have ever been spoken from a lot of the grieving people that I speak with. This definitely seems to resonate with a lot of people. So Inelda explains the stages of grief this way. They call it the journey of grief. They say usually right after you're initially experiencing grief, you start pursuing initial rituals and tasks. So you're busy, you're getting the to-do list done, you're checking things off the list. And then you adjust to your new reality. And then you have to deal with emotional turmoil, is what they call it. Some people describe that as the roller coaster of emotions, or being lost in a forest or lost in a fog, weathering the emotional turmoil. And then eventually, after all that fun stuff, you get to move towards acceptance. And then also, Inelda provides a pretty basic explanation for why we grieve. I like this because sometimes having a more simple explanation of something really complex kind of allows you to start at the foundation and work your way into more complicated things. So for some examples of why we grieve is because our world changes. The familiar pattern of life is gone. The future is unknown. And then roles in life drastically change. So what does end of life look like with dementia? Um, Dementia brings a lot of unique challenges, and also with death and dying, dementia impacts it in an interesting way. Um, uh, the local social worker, Gina Rossi, who we're big fans of here, she recently did a presentation um, on ambiguous loss. She is a social worker who specializes in care for older adults and those with dementia. And so she hosted a presentation recently on ambiguous loss and shared some of these tidbits, which I thought was really interesting and appropriate to include here. So, most of the time, whenever someone is caring for someone with dementia at the end of life, it not usually is the person themselves that has dementia that is making decisions. Usually it is the care partner or the power of attorney or a loved one who is making those decisions. So not only does that person, the care partner, have all of the regular grief and loss that's included with, a loved one dying, but they also have all of these other factors that are specific to them. So I'm going to go through them quickly. Ambiguity is one of them. So, my loved one is so different than they once were. Is this person still the same person that I love? Ambivalence, or do I even have a choice of being a care partner? Or I wish I didn't feel all of these responsibilities for someone else. Unpredictability. How long will this go on for? Or, a sudden decline happens and it is unexpected, and now you have to deal with that and all of what comes with something sudden. Dual roles, so having multiple roles all at one time. You're both the parent and the child, or a spouse and a care partner. You're not just one thing. Past relationship history. Just because someone's dying doesn't erase the past. If they were a wonderful person or kind of a pain, you still have that past relationship history. And then also loss of empathy. So the person with dementia may not be supportive or understanding of your grief and all of the challenges and hardship that comes with being a care partner. And then to that point, we also think about dignity during end of life, especially with folks with dementia, when other people are having to provide that sense of dignity in the environment for a dignified death. And so while that is very much so open for interpretation of what that looks like, some just very basic things that we can consider when it comes to a dignified time and environment during death is we think of things such as nutrition and hydration, pain management, appearance and hygiene, and then just the surroundings and their environment. So, what conversations are next whenever we are leaning into preparing both for our death or for the death of a loved one? So, there's a lot of conversations that come up when we can talk about dying, but one of them definitely is advanced care planning. And what that means is you stating your wishes and preferences regarding your healthcare, your assets, your legacy, you telling somebody else how you want things to go. And that can take a lot of different forms, but really the whole point of this is to alleviate stress and allow time to make challenging decisions. My dad always says that the best time to make a decision is when you don't need to. And so having that time to plan and make a non-emotional decision as much as you can, that is what advanced care planning is. And so there are a lot of formats that you can use to do advanced care planning. The 5 wishes is a document that we have here in our resource library. That is a pretty commonly used one. A do not resuscitate, a living will, appointing a power of attorney to handle all of these things, appointing an executor of your will for after you die. care planning can be done at any time during your adult life, and definitely can also be updated as circumstances change, and however it can fit where your life is, or where you understand your future to be going. The Alzheimer's Association recommends that discussing and doing any of your advanced care planning and advanced directives is best done very early on within your dementia diagnosis, or where the individual with dementia, their cognitive and communication abilities are least impaired, so that we can understand, what does this person want? How does this person want any of their decisions to be made, should they not be able to make those decisions for themselves? It just allows us to continue the dignity of that person throughout the entire journey. And then, along with practical planning, you also can have a lot of other wishes that you can instill and share to people, such as, where is your desired place for dying? Who do you want around? Who do you not want around? Do you want nature or spirituality to be incorporated? Or how would you best prefer to be honored? There's a lot of different things that people don't know unless you tell them. And if it's very important to you, it is absolutely worth it for you to share those things. Um, Advanced care planning is available to all of us, to everyone. If you have a terminal illness, or if you're just a regular old person living your life, as healthy as an ox, then you can still do one. It's very important. Um, and Especially when dementia is a factor, it helps also the care partner know that when they are moving forward with making challenging decisions, they know, my mom already told me what to do in this situation. I can move forward knowing that I'm doing the right thing because my mom already told me she wants XYZ, so I'm going to do XYZ. So that just also helps out in the future in a lot of different ways. So I know when we were talking a bit ago about the different factors that come along with someone in the dying process with dementia, we talk about unpredictability, ambiguity. A lot of times people will describe dementia as a long goodbye or a long death. And I definitely can recognize how, for a care partner, it probably feels, that definition probably resonates. But I also want to recognize and acknowledge how a person with dementia, a person who is diagnosed with dementia, may want their death and their future dying process to be described differently. So I think that is something worth noting, of, when we talk about something that is as personal as death, to recognize that, a person may want their death described in a certain way. And while we have to, of course, consider reality and what, how it impacts everybody and looks, very large scale, I think that's also something important to consider. And then, of course, I also would like to just bring up briefly stigma, and how stigma definitely can play a part in dementia in general, aging in general, any type of disability or sickness or illness in general. But it also plays a part in death and dying. And so here's two definitions that I just wanted to bring up. One is disenfranchised grief, which is the kind of grief that is not openly acknowledged or socially validated. So let's say if your loved one with dementia, who's had to, been on this journey for 20 years, they die. And well-meaning people could possibly be saying, like, "Oof, I'm sure you're so relieved they're in a better place." Whereas you are grieving and you don't feel relief. That could be disenfranchised grief. Just because dementia is involved, or a long, hard struggle is involved, doesn't mean that your feelings are not valid with whatever feelings that you have. And then also stigmatized loss. That is, well, stigma in general is a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. And Stigmatized loss is any time that you have a loss that, again, some people may not take it as seriously or consider it with as much sensitivity because of a stigmatized component is involved. And that just essentially provides more anger, guilt, questioning, depression, spiritual disillusionment. There's so many negative aspects that come along with just not feeling appropriately supported by those who normally would support you. And here's a quote here as we kind of move into our next section is most of us don't know how to die. It is not something we have rehearsed or practiced. We have a mind full of ideas about what will happen, but very little, if any, experience with the process. And that's Rodney Smith, who I believe is an end-of-life doula. Okay, this next slide is a little silly, but also it definitely, you'll see. So this next little section, we're going to talk about what are our preferences for death and dying. And so for me, for Brook Kitto, this is my recipe for a good death for me. Okay. So, and then after this, we will go through and talk about what are your preferences for death. But so here's mine. I'm going to read it out to you. So my ingredients for a good death are minimal regrets, a dash of humility, spouse, children, favorite grandchildren, because I'm going to be 99 years old whenever I die, in my, preferred method. Heaping spoon of contentedness, a view of nature, cozy blankets, and effective pain meds. And then my directions for my good death are prepare the space, surround yourself with family, stirring gently until laughter and tears are in balance. Avoid overmixing with distraction. Keep the moments simple and honest. Season with humility, enough to soften the pride, but not so much that dignity is lost. Simmer contentedness. Let life's contentment infuse the air like a slow stew. Add minimal regrets, chop small. At the last, stir in effective pain meds to taste, and then serve warm with cozy blankets surrounded by love, memory, and quiet. That's just a little bit of a lighthearted explanation for how I would classify my good death. So here are some questions right before we go into our next reflection of how do you classify a good death? Is having a plan or a vigil important to you? So I say vigil, that essentially means the time in which you are living your last moments. That was what we would call the vigil. Is having a plan for that time even important to you? Should you be able to enact a plan during that time? How important is it to you that religious or spiritual beliefs are reflected within your vigil? And what beliefs about those bring you the most comfort? Would you prefer to die at home, in the hospital, in a long-term care facility, or somewhere else? Describe the environment. What do you see, hear, smell? What would you like someone to read, possibly? Poetry, religious passages, other materials. Who do you want around you? Or do you even want anybody around you? Do you want someone to be with you at all times? Or would you like to be left alone at times? Describe how you would like people to treat you. Can they touch you, talk to you? Have you began a legacy project, which essentially is a planned goal or an event to be completed in your memory? And do loved ones know how to continue it or complete it? And then how would you like to feel emotionally or physically? So all of those are things that whenever you're thinking of what is my preferred death? What does a good death mean to me? Those are some things to consider. There's obviously endless amount of things. But we'll kind of move into our next reflection, thinking of all of those things. So again, take a breath. There's no wrong answers. You're not going to have to share this with anybody, but it's just a time that we can sit in and think of these things. And we'll have about 20 seconds per bullet point. So, what are your own preferences for death and dying? What do you consider a good death? And then how do you feel, or do you feel unprepared for or afraid of the last days of life or the grief afterward? And then do your preferences for dying impact how you approach another's death or dying? Okay, and then I have one more little comic to share. This is another one um, to show that big mountainous tasks like talking and thinking about death and dying, um, those things like becoming more comfortable with death and dying, they all happen one step at a time. And so when we're thinking about next steps of this whole journey, gaining insight into death and dying and becoming more comfortable with it, what are some of our next steps? So whenever you kind of hang out in this space that is death care, or you hang out in this end of life care, you'll hear this term float around that's death positive. Now, what does that mean to be death positive? So this source is from the Order of the Good Death. That is a nonprofit that was founded by Caitlin Dowdy. She is another end of life influencer, I almost dare to say. And she's a mortician and just an excellent follow if you're looking for somebody who is death positive. And so this is what that organization has come up with in terms to say if something or someone is death positive. And it just means that you talk about it. Being silent about death does more harm to us than good. Encourage discussion, gatherings, art innovation around death, especially with loved ones and those who you trust. Talking about inevitable death is not morbid, but it displays natural curiosity. So you hear sometimes, especially in South Louisiana or in the southern region, you hear of, people, we don't talk about that. That's not polite to talk about that. Why? If it's inevitable and it's going to happen to all of us, and if it's something that I want to talk about because I'm naturally curious about it in appropriate spaces, you should be able to. The dead body is not dangerous, and one can be involved in the care of their dead loved ones if they wish. This is a whole tangent I could go on, but how disconnected our culture is from death a lot of times, I think is because the death industry is so commercialized in a lot of ways. It wasn't like that 300 years ago, even much less time than that. But that is something to think about. Voting for laws to protect the rights of dying and end of life care, dying people, and end of life care measures to protect that all persons are honored regardless of their status, gender, sex, all of that good stuff helps death positivity. And then also sharing your end of life wishes with others and with your loved ones helps in just a more positive culture around death and an openness of discussion around death and dying. So what does it not mean? You hear death positive and you think, uh-oh, that's, weird. It doesn't mean that you're thrilled by death or that, you're yippee, someone died. That's not it. It's more you are supportive before and after death, and you recognize that people should be able to speak freely about grief and their experiences around death, um, that is what that means to be death positive. So I mentioned earlier Alua Arthur, who was kind of my first introduction into the death positive movement and end of life doulas in general. And this is a quote from her. And sometimes I think about my death because my entire life is leading up to that mystifying moment. If you can't tell, I'm a huge fangirl over Alua Arthur. She is just, if you're looking for someone to make you feel comfortable around death and dying, she is your girl. She's so wonderful. Okay, a next step into becoming more insightful and more comfortable around death and preparing for loss is having moments of mortality. And this essentially is just a time where you sit with yourself or others that you trust, but you sit with yourself and just think, this is all going somewhere. And, allows yourself to kind of pause within the hustle and bustle of your regular life to sit with reality and ground yourself, as some people say. So this is a moment of mortality or an example of that. So Atisha is or was a Tibetan prince and a Buddhist scholar who was born in 982. And he wrote these contemplations of death that they really resonate with me. So I wanted to share those with you as another step in our insight. So Atisha's 9 contemplations of death. Death is inevitable. My lifespan is ever decreasing. Death comes whether or not I am prepared. My lifespan is not fixed. Death has many causes. My body is fragile and vulnerable. My material resources will be of no use to me. My loved ones cannot save me. My own body cannot help me when death comes. So having a moment of mortality like this, we can talk about anything super complicated. We can put a smile on our face and have a pretty slideshow, and we can talk about things that are complicated. But talking about something, doesn't have a lot of action behind it a lot. So having these insightful moments with yourself where you can sit and contemplate on what's important to you, that is what a moment of mortality can provide you. And then now we're going to move on to some resources and support. Here's a quote: service to the dying is a part of the human experience. All of us are going to die. All of us are going to experience end of life with either, actively with our loved ones or, eventually ourselves. So service to the dying is a part of our human experience. So I also want to mention that, we're all in clubs, groups, church groups, friend groups. A lot of those spaces probably already have support and resources around death and dying. So if that's something that you're interested in and kind of stepping into this within a group that you already are a part of, that definitely could be something to look into. But I think it's also important to consider what type of support around this feels right for you. And there, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different support services out there. So seeing which one actually feels right to you and actually feels supportive to you, you can't go wrong with that. Okay, some resources for anticipatory grief. So if you are a current care partner and you are going through anticipatory grief, here are some really great resources. First, I'm going to mention our Alzheimer's Services Care Partner support groups. We have a lot of them. Being in community with others who share those unique challenges that a care partner does can just feel supportive, which is what it's there for. Hospice services. So if your loved one has already been admitted to hospice, or if they're in the end of life stage, I highly encourage look into hospice. Um, because they have on staff already chaplains, social workers, supportive entities, volunteers. They're that are there to support you and your loved one, even beyond just medical needs. And then, of course, an end of life doula. They are there as a listener, as a supportive system, as a connector with other resources to support you during that time. Of course, I'm an end of life doula. I primarily work with people either with dementia or as a care partner for someone with dementia through Alzheimer's services. So you can call me here. And then here's two other lovely people who are local to us, Penny and Robin, and their phone numbers, should you want to call them. Here's some more community resources. I absolutely encourage seeking support from a licensed professional. Everybody, when you're going through a hard time, you will receive so much unsolicited advice. I don't have to tell you that. You already know people who are well meaning will just give bad advice. So, when you're going through a really hard time, it can be important to seek advice from people who are using evidence-based methods. They're not just talking, pulling stuff out the clear air. They're experienced with working through loss and grief. And those are a lot of times social workers and licensed professional counselors. We have a full list of some that we recommend here at Alzheimer's Services. So if that's something you're interested in, we can definitely connect you with that. For people who are diagnosed with dementia or any type of brain change dementia, Brain Cafe is a group that we host here at Alzheimer's Services. For people who are former care partners, so you were a care partner for someone with dementia, they have since passed away, you are discovering what that new journey life path looks like for you in the post care partner world. We have a group here called Sip and Support Gatherings. Our next one is actually next week. So if that's something of interest to you. Then also the retreat at Quarters Lake, that is a group, it's a venue here in the Baton Rouge area that is all around grief support. So they have a lot of different support groups around grief, any type of grief, not just dementia, not just dying, like a loved one at the end of their life. They have pet support, miscarriage, I mean, you name it, divorce support. They have so much around grief and loss. They're managed by the Hospice of Baton Rouge, but you do not have to be a member for them, and their stuff is free there too. So the retreat at Quarters Lake is a great local community resource. And then, of course, advanced care directive education. You don't know what you don't know. So if you are sitting here thinking, I need to do some of that stuff, I have been feeling anxious about what I'm going to do with all of my stuff, and my kids don't know my passwords to stuff, and yada yada. Lean into that. We do a lot of education here through our Making Sense of Sense program, but also we have a ton of local elder law attorneys that do education all the time. So we also have lists of that we can absolutely connect you with. And then I'm also happy to share these slides with Ellen to send in a follow-up email just so that y'all can see these. But here's some online resources on dying. There's Alua Arthur, who I've spoken about a couple times. Her company nonprofit is called Going with Grace. But really, any of these are excellent, excellent resources. And through these resources, you can find others. So like I mentioned, dying, extremely personal. We all have so many different nuances that we prefer. Something out there probably fits what puzzle piece you're looking for. So these are just some really great online resources that I encourage you to look into. And then here are some online resources on grief. One that I definitely want to mention is the Meaning and Hope Institute. Dr. Pauline Boss has a lot of different books, but one of her books is Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. They do free for family care partners a 10-week discussion series online through the Meaning and Hope Institute around that book, which I have heard from care partners using that book, and it has been extremely helpful to them. So if that's also something that could be of interest to you. That's a free online resource. And then here are just some other ones. David Kessler, again, when you're kind of in this, death positive, end of life care sphere, you hear his name a lot when it comes to death and grief and grief care. So he has a really popular group of support groups that are called Tender Hearts. So that also can be just something to check out. And then, of course, I wanted to provide our contact information here. Like I said, we're going to just hold the Zoom open for a little while longer for you to kind of collect your thoughts, write anything else down that you wanted to about your reflection and experience that you had today. And if you have any questions, concerns, comments, compliments, feel free to give us a call or send me an email. This is my email here. But thank y'all so much for today. I had a great time presenting it to you, so I appreciate y'all's time today.
Thank you so much, Brooke. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation. I appreciate you sharing all of your insight with us. So thank you so, so much. And thanks to everyone that joined us. Like Brooke said, we'll leave the Zoom open just a few more minutes in case anybody, has any thoughts or reflections that they'd like to think about. But thank you all so much for taking the time out. And thanks again, Brooke. It was amazing.